I would like to now invite TD Bank Maine President Larry Wold to the podium to introduce our keynote speaker. Larry, thank you and your team at TD for making the Forecast Conference possible and for your tremendous support of MEREDA for many, many years. Ladies and gentlemen, Larry Wold.
Good morning, everybody. It's fun to be here at this one, having been, I'm pretty sure, to every single MEREDA forecast conference we've ever done. And I asked Shelley if she knew exactly when the first one was, and she couldn't remember specifically, but the early 1990s. And I look around the room and I just would guess that we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 times as many people at the event. Consistent with Leslie's comments, I bet there are 20 times the number of women in the room than there were in those early years. And I think the ratio of people wearing ties and not wearing ties is probably completely inverted from maybe 90-10 to the other way around. So a lot of things have changed and evolved, but that's not my job here today to make observations. It's to introduce our speaker. So Heather Johnson is Governor Mills' Commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development. I wasn't positive I knew exactly what a commissioner was. I knew being out of commission was bad, but what's the definition of a commissioner? And now you'll know why you get earning or education credits for this, right? Because you'll learn, as I did, that it comes from the Latin word to entrust. And first of all, I don't want anyone to be bothered by the fact that I will refer to our speaker as Heather rather than as commissioner, because I'll tell you from experience, when you call her commissioner, she very nicely but firmly says, "Please call me Heather." So I will honor that. I've had the good fortune to cross paths with her on a number of different ways. The Maine International Trade Center, Maine and Company, the Maine State Chamber, and her work on the Economic Strategic Plan, which I think she's going to talk about a little bit. And what I've sort of learned is that her schedule is packed. She's very busy, but prides herself on being on time. So be careful. She's usually coming around the corner on two wheels right before she's supposed to be up on the podium. She brings to this role a great mix of experience, having grown up in the relatively small town of Skowhegan and gone on to graduate from the University of Maine. And from there, she had a variety of sales, operational, and managerial roles for large companies such as Nokia and Toshiba, where her job was to introduce new products and oftentimes into new markets. So she has what we in the private sector like to think of as quote-unquote real-world experience that she brings to this government role. And after that, she did end up as the executive director of the Somerset County Economic Development Corporation. And whenever you work with her, you see that this broad range of experience from big corporations and new markets right down to understanding the challenges of smaller rural Maine communities. So I think that based on all of that, and as you'll hear when she speaks, we'll all understand better why the governor entrusted her with the development of our communities and our economy. So please welcome Heather Johnson.
Good morning. Thank you, Larry, and thank you to Gary as well for inviting me to be here today. We're to spend a little bit of time talking about the economic plan. To Larry's point, I came screaming in on two wheels. and just heard the end of the session before me talking about immigration, but that's a really exciting thing for us as we think about the economic plan and what our outlook is. And we can give you some insight into how we're looking at that immigration as we go forward. So we're going to start by queuing up some slides. Let's see. Here we go. So as you think about the economic development, right, over a year ago now, which sounds strange, but over a year ago I was meeting with then Governor-elect Mills on economic development, and I went in with my list of priorities. But before that, right, you do research naturally, and there was no plan. There was no statewide plan, and so, right, I created my own list of priorities and went in and said, here are the things that I think are important, and if we can do some of these things, you'll start to see change. But what became very apparent as we got started is that economic development happens across the state. It doesn't just happen in Augusta, clearly, and it also doesn't just happen in Portland, right? It's across the state. It's about state government a little bit, but it's much more about the private sector. It's much more about local economic development agencies and educational systems. And so it became really clear that we had to have some roadmap that we could all work together from to be able to affect change. And so we started down that path. Over 1,300 people over the course of the last 9 months worked with us on this work. We had people from the private sector, people from nonprofits, people from the public sector and the educational systems and local communities all kind of in these rooms having these discussions. And it was much more about how do we move forward. Barriers are pretty easy, right? Maybe even particularly as Mainers for us, barriers are very easy to talk about. And so then the question is, okay, what do we do about it, right? We can talk about these barriers all day, but what do we want to go do about them, and what do we care most about? Changing the slides would be good. Oh, thanks. So first, we set out a mission, right, that looks at really being a diverse and sustainable economy. We traditionally have had a couple of industries that have driven the bulk of our economy, and so thinking about how do you create sustainability and diversity? So as those markets have their ebbs and flows, we have sustainability and other places to kind of get economic growth from. So there are 3 goals. One is to improve the value-added productivity per employee by 10%. So that looks at how we do things, how do we get more out of that, maybe how do we create more export opportunities, how do we create more innovation that will drive more value. With that, wages should kind of inherently grow. And then the third one is attract 75,000 people to Maine's talent pool. So as point of reference, and I apologize, I won't go into a lot of detail because I'm guessing you did some of this before, our workforce has been stagnant for the last 10 years at about 670,000 people in our workforce. If you think about projecting that out over the next 10 years, you have about 65,000 people who are at retirement age, so are likely to retire in that period of time. And that accounts for people working longer. That accounts for kind of part-time, people kind of finding these transitions into part-time roles. So we'll lose 65,000 people out of the bottom of the workforce in the next 10 years. As you know, we're not having that many kids graduate from high school and or college in that same period of time. And so today, our GDP is compressed because we don't have enough workers. If you project that forward, we've got an even bigger challenge. And so we set out what is a pretty aggressive target at 75,000 people into the workforce over the next 10 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you think about what drives our economy, there are lots of pieces, but we really focused in on 2 specifically. One is the talent, and one is innovation. And so we'll talk briefly about those, and then we'll also this morning talk a little bit about what are the key enablers to those. So if you think about workforce, it's how do we get the skills that we need for the jobs that we need, right? Every day, everybody I talk to, almost every business I talk to says, I need more workers. I need people that can do a whole range of things. And so it's really starting to look at how do we look at workforce as a continuum, right? We tend to, this isn't a Maine thing, but we tend to think about workforce as either everybody's got to have a 4-year degree or everybody should be a tradesperson, right? And those are the messages our kids get. They tend to flow back and forth. And we brought in a bunch of students, too, as part of this work to say, what messages are you getting? What do you know about jobs that are available or not available? How do you think about kind of what your future looks like? And as part of all of that, it became really clear that we need to start looking at our workforce as a continuum, right? Every job is a good job. We need somebody to do every job that exists. And then we also need to find ways that people can move throughout that workforce continuum as they choose to. So a couple of really long-term projects kind of come up as part of that, and some shorter-term pieces. One of the long-term pieces that's a real priority is starting very young with students. I spent some time, Larry talked about when I was at Somerset Economic Development, I spent some time in some third grade classrooms in some really poor rural communities in Somerset County. Over 25% of those students would tell you they're not going to graduate from high school. And I was shocked, right? And so I said, well, why? And they said, well, why would I? They couldn't see themselves in our economy. They couldn't see a path forward. As they looked around, there wasn't a lot of opportunity, and certainly weren't things that they were interested in. And so those kids were 8, right? 8, 9. So we've already lost them at that point. And so then the question is, okay, how do we get ahead of that curve? What does that take? And are there ways for us to work together with communities and with schools and with businesses to try to connect to these students a little bit younger, to try to help them see what some of the ideas are? So if you think about, you know, I have a 9-year-old, he loves to build things. So how do we talk to him about building trades? How do we talk to him about what does it take? What does that look like? What's available to him? How do you get him out to see some of the equipment, right? Those are the things that can keep young students engaged. And so if you think about age-appropriate discussions at every level of schooling, so that when they're in late high school years, right, they're really able to think about what's their future look like and where they want to, what their path is. Everybody doesn't need to have the same path, but we should do a better job and need to do a better job helping students find their own path. So you'll see a lot of work there. The other thing you'll see as part of this work is today we have 100,000 Mainers that are of working age but not part of the labor pool. Those are people that are already here, and we need to engage them back into the workforce. And so there's a whole body of work going on, a collaborative between a number of state agencies as well as some private sector agencies that we're trying to figure out how that will play to bring people back into the workforce. Maybe these are folks that have never been part of the labor pool. Maybe it's people that are disenfranchised. Maybe they have the wrong skills. Maybe they live in places where their skills don't match the jobs that are localized. We don't know. But the reality is we need to know, and we need to find ways to bring people back into the labor pool. So those are the types of things you'll see as it relates to workforce development. When you get into the next work stream, you get into talent and talent attraction. So there we go. So this looks at how do we keep our young people here? What is the stickiness? What do we do to create stickiness for folks with their own communities? And then how do we go talk to people differently about what Maine has to offer from an economic opportunities perspective? You heard earlier there is a small in-migration over the last year, which is one of the first times. If you get under that data, right, it's very southern Maine driven. So if you live north of Portland, you're not seeing that in-migration, right? You're probably still seeing a really aggressive out-migration from some of our rural communities. Some of that's coming to Portland as well. So then the question is, that's great, right? We need more people. We need more people in the entire state. People coming to Portland is amazing. How do we also help people come into some of our other communities? How do we talk about those economic opportunities? How do we show people what business resources are there? If you go back to the SBA awards this year, I think there were 10 of them, and 7 of them were people who weren't from Maine but came to Maine to start their business or weren't living in Maine at that point. But they saw Maine as a real opportunity to start their business. Between kind of the business resources we have available and the entrepreneurial communities that we can create, we have the highest survival rate of small businesses in all of New England. So there are some really good things to talk about. We just don't tell people. So we've got some resources there, and we have some opportunities. So talent attraction will be a big piece of the effort. You saw a piece of that at the end of last year, trying to talk to people who have grown up in Maine, left Maine for a variety of reasons, likely were home over the holidays potentially. And so talking to them about, why they might come back, what opportunities exist. We believe, and the research shows, the easiest people and the lowest barrier to come back to Maine are people who have a connection to Maine. And so start there, right, and work out. There's a LinkedIn campaign recently that targeted people who had career experience in Maine from their LinkedIn profiles, but don't currently live in Maine. You wouldn't have seen that, right, because obviously you currently live in Maine. But those are the types of things that are very kind of step-by-step that will start to create a different culture as people think about Maine. Yeah?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to find Eddie. Eddie, you need to call home. You need to call home. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So let's see. So I guess we were talking about kind of these attempts at marketing. The other piece is you all will attract more people to our workforce than the state ever will, right? So then the question is, what tools can we create that allow you to be more effective and to reduce your barriers to bring people into your own workforces? So we're looking at simplifying student opportunity tax credit, things like that allow you to go out and attract in your workforce, market your opportunities, those types of things. We're also looking at things that create talent pools so that you would be able to see, okay, here are the people that are interested in these markets geographically. Here are the people that are interested in these types of work. Here are the people maybe that would be ready for apprenticeships or internships so that you can go out and pick your best talent and have that happen as easy as possible. So I'm spending a lot of time on talent and workforce this morning. It's clearly one of the biggest opportunities we have as it relates to economic development, and so we're going to stay focused there. So some other key themes, though, clearly popped up, right? We talked a little bit about innovation and promoting innovation, and we'll spend some time on that. If you aren't tired of hearing me talk about connectivity yet, get ready. You will be soon. There's no way for our communities to thrive and grow if they aren't connected. Actually, I had somebody on my team this morning that I was trying to talk to as I was driving down here, and they're like, well, call me on this phone because this phone doesn't work where I am. And I was like, that's not where we should be, right? That's not current marketplace. If you go to other major metro markets, you don't have that discussion. You just call them, or you email them, or you text them, and people can get information. People can access global markets. If we think that we have real market opportunity, particularly for our rural communities, it may not just be in that community. I mean, when you were isolated to only having revenue generating from a 25-mile radius, you were really closed in about who you could sell to. That doesn't exist today unless you don't have access and connectivity. If you think about what those opportunities look like, if you think about distance education, learning, healthcare, aging in place, infrastructure, all of that is driven by being connected. So you will continue to hear us beat that drum. I think we're going to go back to innovation just for a second. So one of the things you'll see about innovation, and one of the reasons I think you all may care about this innovation discussion a little bit, is if we can diversify our economy, then we'll have a broader commercial base, which is helpful, right? It's helpful as it expands out into different markets. It's helpful as it creates different streams so that there's more vitality and a little bit more sustainability. And so if you think about some of the opportunities we have, Maine is the doorway to the consumable markets in the US, right? We are one day's drive from Boston, New York, DC, and most markets will tell you Chicago. You have to drive pretty fast to get to Chicago in a day, but they will call it that from a logistics perspective that's within a 24 term. And so if you think about what people need now and what people are looking for, traceable food systems is important, right? And we have a lot of opportunity around traceable food systems. We import 95% of our fish in the Northeast, comes from Europe, comes from South America. We have a long legacy in Maine, a long heritage of fishing and farming. We can do that work here and then send it down the coast. It's a great option around global climate solutions. It reduces the impact of bringing in that food And it also creates traceable food systems that have high value and high production here for our state. So that's one piece. If you think about innovation in forest products, right? Can we start building with CLT? Can we have CLT manufacturing here so that as you all are looking at expanding stock, some of that can be wood-based, right? Wood fiber-based. We're looking now, there's a group in Madison looking at wood fiber insulation. Again, a great opportunity as we think about how do we make global climate solutions from what our natural assets are? Where do we have these natural opportunities to grow? Wood fiber insulation is very rampant in Europe. They're doing a lot of that work now. So it's proven technology. It's just not here. So as we start to do some of that work, how do we change the landscape of our building infrastructure? How do we make it more modern, more current? And how do we help it become part of a climate sink that can, a carbon sink that can help with some of the climate solutions? All of those pieces can play together to create a dynamic market for us there. The other thing, I guess you guys can't see this. I can only see my own chart. So the other thing as we think about it are really stabilizing supply chains. So we have an existing portfolio of businesses today that most of you know what they look like, right? A lot of forest products, a lot of farming, some fishing work, and some other things. If you think about the impact that changes in the paper industry have had on forest products, you start to think about, well, geez, forest products is on a decline. The reality is forest products is a real opportunity as we go forward because there are all kinds of new things now people can do with parts of the tree, residuals of the tree. And if we continue to look at those, it strengthens the supply chain all the way down. So when it was just paper, right, loggers had to sell to paper companies, and that was really their only choice. And so when they didn't have paper companies to sell to, there wasn't an option for them. Now, as you start to diversify that and think about, you know, again, wood fiber insulation, you start to think about using nanocellulose from trees to make clothes and fuel and those types of things, now loggers have a lot more opportunity. And so how do we strengthen that supply chain? How do we get people back into logging, right? If you go talk to any of these paper companies now, they're like, you need to get more loggers. That's the first thing you can do to strengthen the forest products industry. So, you know, these supply chains can create impact across the state and support the existing businesses. So if you think about this, think about if you put, well, let's use logging. Let's use forest products. If you put a cross-laminated timber facility in Lincoln, right? There's some talk about that. They need wood. They also need to be able to ship product out. So you've got an asset in Lincoln. You may have a staging asset in southern Maine somewhere. In northern Maine, right? You've got a lot of work around logging. And so not only can you create a vibrant kind of cycle there, you can also spread the tax base out across the state and create and intentionally and deliberately create some balance there around workforce and around tax base. So the more we can think about kind of these supply chains and deliberate locations of supply chains, the better off we'll be because we won't have all of our workforce needs in one space. We also won't have all of our tax density in one space. So we'll try to think creatively with businesses as they work through that. So if you go to the next kind of couple of bullets in the strategic plan, we talk a lot about the regulatory landscape. We heard that loud and clear. It's not about our standards. Our standards are good. Keep those. That's what adds value to our state. But we have to be better at the work. We have to be more transparent. We have to be clearer with what's required. We also have to allow for some parallel processing, right? We're too slow with how we do things. And so as we think about, you know, right now you do one thing, and then that gets approved, and you do the next thing, and that gets approved, and you do the next thing. We need to be able to line those up when they aren't necessarily, when one's not necessary to get to the next one, so that we can get our permitting processes streamlined. The other thing we need to do is create some transparency. If you go out and buy something on Amazon, right, or your 9-year-old goes out and buys something on Amazon, you know where it is, when it's going to arrive at your house, when it's at the dispatch center, what's happening with it, if they can't deliver on it, if there's a problem with the order, all of that is at your fingertips. If you put in a significant permitting application, right now it's really hard to know where it is, when it should come out of that system, and what's going on with it, what questions there are, who's looking at it, where it's being reviewed today. And that transparency is something that we think the private sector has asked for and that we need to try to deliver. And so the Department of Environmental Protection, DECD, Secretary of State's office, a number of groups, a number of state agencies are now working together. Step one is streamline the processes, really understand the processes, see where they interconnect, figure out what we can do there and make those transparent. Step two will be to put a technology layer on top of them so that things can be automated and move more seamlessly and be visible to everyone. Anybody who puts in a permit, you should know kind of what the outcome is and when you should hit that and what changes, right? Some things change. As they review permits, things change for sure, right? They learn something about the science, or there's a problem with the location, or whatever. There are a variety of things that can come up. Those should be clear, what that is, and when we hit those pieces, it should be clear that there's a trigger for people to know that there's a problem, and then how do we regroup to fix that problem as quickly as possible. So again, it's not about changing the standards. I haven't heard that actually from any business, you need to change the standards, but we've heard a lot about we need to be better at how we do it. So that work will happen and is going on. And then there are a couple of pieces that I think the last two pieces we'll talk about, I think are things maybe that this room will be fairly interested in. When we did the economic plan, usually economic plans think about industry sectors and what do you do to create industry sectors. And now they're really starting to talk about workforce because every state's facing a similar challenge to Maine with our workforce. But it became really clear that in Maine, we needed to also think about infrastructure. Our housing stock, right? Where is our housing stock? Is it the right housing stock? Is it what people want? Is it the housing stock we can attract talent with? Are there enough commercial spaces, right, for people to grow? What does that look like? How do we create a more future-looking set of infrastructure? Maybe it's transportation, maybe it's housing, things like that. And so, and certainly broadband and connectivity infrastructure will fall into here as well. We already talked about that. But so as you think about that, it's really trying to think about what does this look like? What tools do people need in order to be able to go do more of that work? If you think about the state's role, our hope and our goal is to be able to set a clear environment that allows the private sector to kind of jump in and thrive. We're never going to be able to make the market. That's just not what we do or what we're good at. What we should be good at is being able to create an environment that you all then can go do that work and thrive in that environment. So that's what you'll see from us as we start talking about infrastructure and supporting infrastructure, is to try to look in partnership of, are there transportation options that allow for flexibility for people? Are there different rural models that will work differently than some of the city models, right? If you think about the work, a lot of it is very kind of what they call urban. I guess for us that's Portland and Lewiston focused, and Magor focused, but there are some rural models that people are testing in other states and certainly in parts of Maine that are interesting, that we need to think about. Are there ways for us to think about infrastructure in a more rural way as well to balance the two? So you'll see a lot of discussion there, housing stock. One of the things we did is, as we did this work, was start to talk to people who we were trying to attract. So we went out to some colleges and said, tell us what will attract, what would bring you to Maine? What would make you think about Maine? What are the things you're thinking about as you're making your decision? And housing was on that list for them, right? They want to live in a particular, we had very consistent things. Now, we talked to similar people potentially because they were high potential from high targeted schools. So, it's a group of people, maybe they have very similar needs. Maybe that's not ubiquitous, so we need to think about that. But they wanted a lot of flexibility. They wanted high quality of life. A lot of them didn't want to drive or they didn't drive. I was shocked at how many people in the early 20s stages don't have a driver's license. In rural Maine, that was the rite of passage. The first day you could get your license, you went to try because it was the only way you could move around. So, I think as we think about this, thinking about not about maybe how I would look, or somebody my age would look at housing, and is housing an investment or not an investment, but thinking about it from their perspective around talent mobility and that chance to remove barriers for them, to let them try different markets, find a place they can connect to. How do we connect them into our communities in a way that's effective? How do we give them the walkable cities that they're asking for, and the real mobility there? So it was a really interesting discussion and adds a different layer of complexity to infrastructure as we think about kind of what those market needs are outside of maybe the traditional, first-time home buyer programs. We still have a lot of that. There's good capital in some of those programs. Frankly, we should talk about some of those programs as we start to attract talent. We should be thinking about how do we leverage those programs for people. But there are probably some other tools that we can collectively create to be able to attract people into our market. The other thing I think we would say after having gone through this process is there are a ton of resources that we just don't tell people about, right? There are so many first-time homebuyer resources that I had no idea about. I mean, we're not marketing those right now because, frankly, they weren't really even on our radar. As we talk about talent attraction, being able to utilize those types of programs are going to be key to how we can bring in people to our state. As we did, a bunch of surveying work, what we saw there's a real point in people's lives that they are looking maybe to come to Maine. We have a value proposition that works particularly well for young families, right, that are looking to start to find that balance of great outdoor recreation assets, high quality of life. They tend to be very climate conscious. And so places where you have cold water and high value and lots of trees and good green space is of real value. And so there are some sweet spots where our value proposition is incredibly effective. We need to talk to those people and about those types of things that they're interested in. And so as we think about infrastructure, as we create those opportunities, we think it's a good way to talk about not just real estate, but broader infrastructure. So those are the diverse things there. Long story short, this economic plan, right, is not magic. We'll say what it is a roadmap intended to create opportunity for all of us to find points where we can collaborate and create leverage. We're seeing there are some really good programs across the state that we're getting to see as part of this work, figuring out how to shine a spotlight on those so that others can see that as well and learn from them, and to figure out how and where can we create connections. So as an example, if we're thinking about internships, do you all want interns? Are there places that you want to accept interns? Are there things, areas of real concern for you as it relates to workforce that you can help us prioritize of, okay, well, these are some clear challenge areas. We should think a little bit more about this as a priority or move these first. And so that's the work that's happening now. As we shift to implement, we'll implement in very much the same way we drafted, which is kind of cross-functionally. There'll be private sector, public sector, nonprofits, education, and then industry experts in whatever sector it is. So we'll look for feedback from all of you and try to get it in as unobtrusive a way as possible to make sure that as we are prioritizing some of that work, it lines up with your priorities as well. So with that, I want to thank all of you. I'm excited to learn more about what you're doing, and I appreciate the time. Thank you. Yeah, good to see you.
Thank you, Heather, for those wonderful remarks. For those of us who might want to delve in and read the state's 10-year economic plan, we will get information from Heather's office and Maine.gov/DECD. Okay, so there's a lot of information there. I know I'm interested in learning more about some of the information that's in that plan, so Maine.gov/DECD if you want to read more. So again, thank you, Heather, for those remarks and for sharing those comments with us. MEREDA certainly looks forward to working with the state and with the Department of Economic and Community Development As we know, it's so much of it is about workforce and demographics in Maine. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us, but I think there's a lot of great opportunities as well.